The 1990s are often seen as a decade of optimism in the West, a time where democracy had won out over communism, Europe was free to decide its own future, and the US stood as the undisputed power of the world. Yet the 1990s were one of the bloodiest decades in recent history, from the ethnic conflict of former Yugoslavia, through to the dissolution of the Soviet Union and beyond. Far from peace, conflict was the order of the day. The wounds of the 90s still linger on in many places, and Rwanda is no exception. Located in Central Africa, Rwanda had been torn apart by 4 years of civil war between 1990 and 1994, culminating in a genocide which in just 100 days saw over 80% of the country's Tutsi population murdered. But why did the Rwandan Genocide happen? In this video, we'll be exploring some of the underlying causes behind the genocide, from ethnic tensions to a lack of intervention from outside powers and others. As ever, don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, all that fun stuff since it really does help. Without further ado, let's delve in. Rwanda was one of the many territories seized during the scramble for Africa and became a part of German East Africa in the late 19th century. Rwanda primarily was composed of two ethnic groups, the Hutu and the Tutsi. As was all the rage back then, the Germans used racial theories to develop the Hamitic hypothesis. In this, the Tutsi had migrated from the Horn of Africa and subjugated the local Hutu. As the Horn of Africa was geographically closer to Europe, the Germans elevated the Tutsi in the belief that they were superior. For example, local Tutsi chieftains known as Mwami were given control over areas that had historically been ruled by the Hutu. This process continued until the Germans lost Rwanda to Belgium in 1919, and the Belgians decided that the German method of colonial rule was quite effective. The preferential treatment of Tutsi combined with the use of ethnicity cards led to the idea that the Tutsi were foreigners, oppressing the native Hutu majority, which led to incredible resentment. For the colonial administration, this setup was perfect, as the Rwandan population could be easily divided and controlled, but as we'll see, this system would have far-reaching consequences. The exact origins of the Tutsi are heavily debated, but many of the differences between them and the Hutu stem from social differences that arose during the colonial period. Generally, the Belgians classed a person that owned over 10 cattle to be a Tutsi, which extended to landholders. This also meant that farmers were classed as Hutu, helping to solidify a racial stereotype for either group. After decades of Belgian control and a brief stint as a Tutsi-led monarchy, Rwanda underwent a revolution and finally became independent in 1961 alongside Burundi. Soon after, a Hutu-dominant government led by Gregoire Kayibanda took control and pursued a pro-Hutu policy. Quotas were introduced for education and government positions, which led to increased competition and rising frustration amongst the Rwandan populace. Combined with unemployment and a weakening economy, the groundwork was set for rising ethnic tension. The ruling Rwandan party was known as Parmehutu and also instigated ethnic clashes, leading to waves of mainly Tutsi refugees fleeing to neighbouring countries such as Uganda, Burundi and Zaire, which nowadays is the Democratic Republic of the Congo. These refugees would become important later. In 1973, Kayibanda would be overthrown by his defense minister, Juvenal Habyarimana, subjecting Rwanda to military rule until a new political party called the MRND was formed. Unlike his predecessor, Habyarimana and the MRND aimed for a united Rwandan identity and abolished the quotas, but gradually returned to these as the Tutsi made for a useful political scapegoat, and so began a new era of persecution. Over the years, waves of violence against the Tutsi swept across Rwanda and other countries, displacing thousands of people as refugees who would later settle. Habyarimana's regime feared that the return of these refugees would pose a security risk, and barred their entry by using overpopulation and land scarcity as justification for this. For the Rwandan refugees, the desire to return back home was strong. The difficulty of integrating into their new host countries, combined with Habyarimana's tightening of the borders, forced the exile to decide on returning through violent means. In 1979, the Rwandese Alliance for National Unity, also known as RANU, was formed to represent the interests of the Rwandan diaspora. Many of its members were soldiers in various armies, with many serving in the Ugandan Civil War between 1981 and 1986. This gave the soldiers of RANU essential military experience and contacts that would later prove invaluable. As persecution against the refugees increased, the impetus to return became stronger and the means for an armed invasion began to be built up. Weapon caches and military training were given to recruits in secret, and victory in the Ugandan Civil War emboldened the National Resistance Army, which would become the Rwandan exiles' main military force. After all, if they won this war, what could stop them from winning another? In 1987, RANU adopted the 8-point plan to broaden their appeal, and changed their name to the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or the RPF. After years of deliberation, the decision was finally made to invade Rwanda, and the stage was set for civil war. In a revised history of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, Alan Cooperman explains that the RPF expected Habyarimana's regime to conduct retaliation massacres against the Tutsi population, but decided that it was a price worth paying, yet this assumption would later prove catastrophic. It became apparent to the RPF that they couldn't just blitz their way into Rwanda, and so a 4-year-long protracted war began. Both the MRND and RPF made attempts to negotiate, but both sides were hesitant and stalled peace talks. Ceasefires were made and broken, and killings of both Tutsi and Hutu became common by either side. In early 1993, the RPF broke a ceasefire and rapidly advanced across the country, threatening the capital of Kigali. Now facing immense international pressure and possible military defeat, Habyarimana sat down for peace talks, ending in the Arusha Accords, which was signed in August 1993. A transitional government was set up to implement the agreement, including democratization and military integration, but yet again both sides stalled. The Arusha Accords stipulated a mix of Hutu and Tutsi politicians in the government, as well as the fusion of the NRA into the Rwandan army, which neither side would realistically agree to. Throughout this chaos, the conditions for genocide had gradually been built up. Hutu elites had convinced the populace of the danger of the Tutsis by playing on common racial tropes, and made extensive use of radio whilst weapons were given out to the masses. The exact process of the genocide is extremely complicated, so I won't have time to cover it all here, but by 1994, all that was needed was a single spark. A large proportion of the populace was prepared for slaughter. That spark came in April 1994 when Habyarimana was assassinated when his plane was shot down and a power vacuum occurred in Kigali. Immediately after, the Hutu elites ordered the massacres to begin. Tutsi weren't the only victims, but moderate Hutu and the Pygmy Twa people were also targeted. Anyone that didn't partake in the killings were assumed to be traitors, creating a perpetual cycle of kill or be killed. Whilst this was occurring, the international response was somewhat muted. The United Nations sent a force designated UNAMIR to de-escalate the situation. Led by Romeo Dallaire, UNAMIR was given very few resources and the impact on the genocide was minimal, something which the UN has been extremely criticised for. In any case, the United States refused to intervene, and France was criticised for actually helping the MRND party by providing military support in order to secure influence of the country. The genocide came to an end after 100 days when the RPF secured victory and brought an end to the civil war. By this point, over 500,000 people had been killed at a rate which had shocked even the RPF, which had been prepared to accept sacrifices. To this day, the RPF still rules Rwanda and follows a policy of nationalism ignorant of ethnic differences in order to reconcile the two groups and ensure nothing like this ever happens again. So, why did the Rwandan genocide happen? In short, the long-term ethnic tensions between Hutu and Tutsi that had been developed over Rwanda's colonial history was a very easy source of tension that could be exploited by elites. The lack of an international response also emboldened the perpetrators, and when Habyarimana was killed, Rwanda's power structure completely collapsed, leading to the perfect conditions for genocide. On the 7th of April every year, Rwanda holds the Tutsi Genocide Memorial Day in remembrance of the victims and their families. Thanks for sitting through this video if you made it this far. It's been probably one of the more difficult videos to research for fairly obvious reasons, but I hope you enjoyed. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.